So we've just for preface, if this does make it into the video, Matt and I just finished our piece of the episode, and then we realized there's a little bit more to talk about. So we're just doing this shoulder piece of content now.
Yeah, and I have my space station background.
Perfect.
All right, so this is kind of what I was talking about, that experience design process. This crayon drawing I did a while ago, but it took about 5 years to sort of develop this into its current, its current form.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are two things I'm going to share with you here. The first is the experience design process, and then this scorecard that I created to determine whether you're going to have trouble or not creating this experience. And so I'll show you how this works. So the first step of this process is to create a shared point of reference for all the people defining the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is getting the idea out of people's heads and onto paper, or out into the world. So you create an experience definition in this first step. So that would be something like the user walks into the room, the lights are dim, there's a pedestal in the middle of the room, and there's a product glowing on it. They walk up to the product, the room lights up, and they're surrounded by images of forest projected on the walls around them, and then the sounds of the forest. And then they pick up the product, and fireworks go off. And then when they leave with the product, they feel like they had this great experience and they bought the product. That's a very rough.
So it's that crucial first step, as we were talking about on the show, is just we just eliciting the right emotion, setting in the right experience that we want to come away with without any technical conversation at all.
Right. It's purely human experience is defined here. And then in this next step, the second step, this little light bulb here represents the idea that you're talking about here. This is what it's like in your head. And then this is what it's like in the real world. And in between here, we have this metaphor of a prism to break it down into the different the different work streams. Now that the high level thing here is there's a customer that is having a brand experience. And then this product technology, content, architecture, and story part of it is the thing that we talked about, which is what's the work that you have to do to make the product work? What's the work you have to do? What technology do you need to tell the story? What content do you need to tell the story? What physical space or architecture do you need to tell the story? And then what is the story?
Mm-hmm.
And if you break this down into the work properly, then what shows up on the other end here should look exactly like what you had in your head.
Makes sense.
And then the next step is this third step, which is, having a shared goal, which is, this fork in the road. Can I produce this thing, or do I have to make a prototype to prove it out first?
Yeah.
And so this line over here represents this very important barrier between the things that you're experimenting with and the things that you want to expose people to in the real world.
Yeah.
So let's say that you go through this exercise and you have no questions across the domains of product technology, content, architecture, and story. You can check all these boxes. Guess what? You can write a brief and you can create the experience. If, however, you ask the questions in this evaluation and it looks like this, well, I know what the product is and I know what technology I want to use, but I don't know how to create the content, or I don't have the architecture worked out, or I don't know what the story is going to be.
Yeah.
Then you go through this process of prototyping one sprint at a time as you tick off the boxes for these different things. And then eventually,
out of interest with that, in these sprints that you've kind of outlined, are you always trying to hit all of the crosses and ticks in one sprint, or is it that a sprint is typically, we'll focus in on the content this sprint and try and get that nailed down. The next sprint, we're going to look at the architecture, or whatever the cycle might be.
Well, I've always found that if you focus on one particular swim lane, you can focus mostly on that. And then in the process, you start to answer the other questions and the other unknowns. And you actually may come up with new questions for these other, these other domains that you think are checked off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually you get to a point where you're like, okay, I've got this one last thing. I just need to, figure out how to create 8K spherical content. That's the hard thing. So you end up figuring it out. Then you can jump over the wall here and then write a brief that says, okay, this is the product. We're going to be using a BrightSign box, of course. We're going to create content, spherical 8K. We're going to, do some architectural stuff. And then the story is, you walk in the room and you're immersed in the forest, and then you walk away with a pair of, action adventure pants or whatever it is that you're trying to sell. And then underlying all of this is this idea of customer and brand. This is the same thing up here. When you're going through this exercise, customer and brand are the kind of the audience, and the experience is the target.
Okay.
And so if you think that way, then as you're working on these things, you can always check in on the foundation and say, hey, am I doing the right thing for the customer? Am I supporting the brand in the way I want to? And then when you produce the brief, it's going to do the jobs that you want for the customer and the brand. Now, how do you know whether you can be successful or not? Well, you're doing this sprint process, and then you can use this little scorecard to say, okay, here's the customer and brand information. Here's the experience that we defined written over here, because that's the goal, that's the target.
Yeah.
And then these are the 5 things I have to do really well to achieve that target. And so let's say that I'm in the first sprint here, and I know what the product is, and I know what technology is required, but I don't know these other things. Then in this scorecard, I would tick this box and I'd get 20 points. I'd tick this box and get 20 points.
Yeah.
And then I'd X this box. I would not be able to get 20 points. And so my score is 40% chance of success.
Yeah.
Very, very high level, wet finger in the air assessment of whether or not you can do it.
Yeah.
If I get here and I'm out of time, I can say, okay, I have an 80% chance of success, but I know I'm going to have problems in the domain of content. My content's going to give me problems.
Sure.
If I get here, my chances of success, are closer to 100%. Maybe the score here is 18 and the score here is 15 and whatever. So you're never going to have 100% here, but at least you have an idea of where it's going to fall down. And this process is great because when you're focusing on these domains, if someone who's an architectural specialist keeps on bringing the conversation to the architecture, or somebody who's a technology specialist and all they want to do is talk about technology, you have the ammunition to say, hey, we're not working on that right now. We're working on content. And that prevents a lot of churn in these projects, because you know what you're working on, and you know what your goal looks like, and you know what the experience you're trying to create is.
Yeah. Yeah. And you just need to be successful on those deliverables. And that's the most important thing.
Exactly right. And so that's the process in a nutshell. And it's a way that it's a process that I developed to avoid the annoying things that kept on happening over and over again. Which
I'm sure we're all familiar with that process.
Right.
No, that's good. I mean, they should probably have to charge for this piece, to be honest. We'll put this behind a paywall. I think it's well worth it.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, that silly crayon drawing took me 5 years to come up with. So
right, exactly. Yeah,
the world's most expensive crayon drawing.
I mean, I think it's great, and that's hopefully for those who watch this, I think they're so insightful, because it is what you've written out there seems very logical and simple, but it's a lot of trial and error behind making something like that. It's the experience behind that document that really shines through. You can actually see just on the top right hand corner there, it says 2017, which I think is a real testament.
Well, that's when I finished it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's now standing the test of time. Once you put the logic in place, it's there forever.
Exactly right. Yeah. So that I think is a good little nugget, and it's actually a good way for people who want to engage in these kinds of projects to assess whether they're ready to engage in that. Because the worst thing that can happen is that you're in this, you're in that phase 1 prototype, but you think you're ready to produce something, and you spend real money to build it, only to find that it doesn't work.
Yeah. Then you got a much bigger issue to deal with at that point.
Right. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Matt, I really appreciate that. That's super insightful. A lovely bit of shoulder content as well, which I'm sure I'll make something out of.
Great. All right. Greetings. Adieu from the space station.
Yeah. See you later, Earthlings.